There's a kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin. It goes all the way down into the part of you that still believes things will be okay, and it squeezes. I know that cold. I've lived inside it. Most people hear blizzard and think of something they've seen through a window. Warm inside, hot coffee, maybe a candle. They watch the white chaos outside and feel something close to gratitude, glad it's not me. But I wasn't behind a window that night. I was in it. I am in it even now when I close my eyes and let myself go back. The man I'm going to tell you about wasn't remarkable in any way the world would notice. No medals, no headlines, no ceremony when it was over. He was just a weathered cowboy in a county most maps spelled wrong, riding a half-blind horse into a storm that had already killed 2 calves and knocked out the power to every homestead within 40 miles. He almost turned back. I need you to understand that. He almost turned back. But he didn't. And what he found out there, in that white, howling, merciless nothing, changed the rest of his life in ways he's still not entirely sure how to explain. This is that story, all of it. The parts he'd rather forget and the parts he holds like something sacred. I'm telling it because somebody should. Have for 32 years now. Not a diary, I want to be clear about that. A logbook. There's a difference even if my daughter rolls her eyes every time I make that distinction. Diaries are for feelings. Logbooks are for facts. Except the truth is, after long enough, the facts start carrying the feelings, so maybe the distinction is thinner than I like to admit. The entry from that night, February 11th, going on 12 years ago now, is the shortest one in the whole stack of books I've filled. 3 lines. Storm came in fast, rode out anyway, found something I wasn't looking for. That's it, 3 lines, which is funny because that night is the one I think about more than almost any other in my 59 years of living. You'd think a man would write more. But I was too exhausted when I got back, and by the time I had the energy to write, I didn't have words big enough to fit what had happened. So I wrote small and let the small words carry the weight. My name is Elias Crowe. I ranched 230 acres in the Powder River country of Wyoming for most of my adult life. I came to that land at 26, married at 28, buried my wife at 44, and kept ranching because I didn't know anything else, and because the land didn't ask me how I was doing. That last part mattered more than I could explain. I'm telling this story now because my granddaughter found the logbook. She's 12, and she reads everything she can get her hands on, including things that aren't meant for 12-year-olds. She found that entry, storm came in fast, rode out anyway. Found something I wasn't looking for, and she climbed into the chair across from me at the kitchen table and looked at me with those dark, serious eyes she got from her father and said, "Grandpa, tell me what you found." So I'm telling, starting from the beginning of that night, which means starting from a different kind of cold than the blizzard. February in Powder River country isn't a season, it's a sentence. The wind comes off the big horns like it has a grievance, and the snow doesn't fall so much as it attacks, horizontal, hard, fine as glass dust. By February, you've already lost track of what green looks like. The sky is a particular shade of gray that I have never seen reproduced in any painting or photograph, a color somewhere between pewter and grief. The cattle know it. The horses know it. Even the barn cats go still and low-bellied in February, which is saying something because barn cats are constitutionally opposed to being impressed by anything. I've been awake since 4 that morning, which was normal. The storm had been forecasted since the day before advisory, the radio called it, which out here means prepare to fight for your life. I'd spent the daylight hours making sure the herd was accounted for, the hay situation was solid, the waterers weren't frozen over, and the barn was patched in the 2 places where last year's ice had pulled the boards loose. My hired hand, a kid named Denny who was 23 and smelled perpetually of motor oil, had helped through the afternoon before I sent him home. His truck was unreliable in good weather. I wasn't going to have his death on my conscience. By 6 in the evening the storm was real, not advisory, not watch, real. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the world outside disappear in degrees. First the fence line, then the cottonwood stand at the edge of the yard, then the barn light, which I could normally see from the house like a small yellow star. Gone. All of it swallowed. I ate standing up, which is a habit I developed after Margaret died. She hated it. Said only people in a hurry ate standing up, and I was never in a hurry, so why the rush? I've never been able to explain it, even to myself. Sitting at a table alone feels like a performance with no audience. Standing up feels like you're just fueling up between tasks, which is somehow easier to bear. I ate leftover beans and half a piece of bread and drank coffee that was too old and too strong and stared at that window, and I was fine. I was going to stay inside, let the storm do what storms do, check the barn in the morning. I was fine. And then the fence line came back. Not the whole fence line. Just a section, maybe 30 yards of post and wire that appeared for about 4 seconds when the wind shifted and the snow thinned momentarily. And in that 4-second window, I saw that one of the rails was down. The northeast corner section, the one that bordered the old Hadley easement, the one that separated my east pasture from the creek drainage beyond. 4 seconds and then it was gone again, white. I stood there for a long moment, thinking hard. The east pasture had 7 cows and 1 mare in it. The mare, whose registered name was something ridiculous that the previous owner had given her, which I'd never bothered to change from the papers, but which everyone including me just called Rue, was heavily pregnant. 3 weeks from her due date, maybe less. She'd been restless for 2 days, which is the kind of sign you learn to read when you've been around horses long enough. Not ready, but close. Body getting ready to get ready. The fence was down. The creek drainage beyond it was a rough tangle of willow scrub and wash cuts that dropped 20 feet in some places. In good weather, horses generally avoided it. In a blizzard, disoriented and panicking, anything was possible. I told myself, the cows are herd animals. They'll stay together. They'll drift with the storm, maybe push into the draw where the old windbreak is. I told myself, Rue is smart. Horses know when to shelter. I told myself, you are 57 years old and this is a whiteout and there is no reason. I had my coat on before I finished the thought. The coat deserves its own sentence. It was a canvas duster I'd had for 21 years, oilskin treated every fall, and it was the color of old mustard and smelled like lanolin and saddle leather, and the specific wood smoke of 100 different fires. Margaret had called it ugly from the first day she saw it, and maintained that position for 16 years. I called it perfect. It was the only argument we ever had where I was definitively right, and she could never quite say so out loud. But the fact that she patched the left elbow twice without being asked told me she knew it too. I put on the coat. I put on the wool underlayer, the insulated pants, the face wrap, the hat with the ear flaps I'd sworn I'd never be old enough to need. I pulled on 2 pairs of socks and the sorrel boots that had seen worse than this, although not much worse. I took the rope, the kit bag, the flashlight, and I filled the inside breast pocket of the coat with hand warmers that I cracked and shook to activate. Then I went to the barn. My horse, Granger, a 16-hand blue roan gelding who was 12 years old and had seen enough weather to be unimpressed by it, turned his head when I came in and gave me a look that was very clearly a reprimand. It's a specific look horses give you when they know what you're about to ask of them, and they think you're being unreasonable. He had one white eye, the left one, from a wire injury years back. The white eye always looked more offended than the other one. I know, I told him. I saddled him anyway. He held still for it, which was its own kind of loyalty. Granger had never been an enthusiastic horse. He wasn't warm or expressive or the kind of animal that nickered when he saw you. What he was dependable, steady, careful, smart in the way that comes from long experience rather than natural inclination. He was the right horse to take into a whiteout, not because he'd enjoy it, but because he'd work through it without drama, and drama was the last thing I needed. I opened the barn door, and the night hit us like a wall. The snow was moving sideways, not drifting, moving with purpose and velocity, fine crystals that found every gap in my face wrap and made my eyes water immediately. The wind was the kind that takes your breath back before you can use it, so every inhale is a small fight. The temperature, which had been 14 degrees at sundown, had dropped. Granger's exhaled breath came out in dense white bursts. We went. I'll tell you something about riding in a whiteout that you won't read in books, because the people who write books generally don't do this kind of thing. Direction stops being a concept. I knew my land. I'd walked and ridden every acre of it for 31 years. I knew where the ground dipped, where the drainage ran, where the old fence posts were that you had to watch for. I knew it the way you know a room in your own house in the dark, not by sight, but by memory and body. And within 5 minutes of leaving the barn, I was navigating entirely on that bone-deep knowledge because there was nothing to see. Nothing. The flashlight was nearly useless. It lit up the snow and made everything worse. A wall of white glare instead of darkness. So I kept it off and trusted the roan and trusted my own accumulated 31 years of walking this ground. Granger moved carefully. Not slowly, he wasn't dawdling. Carefully. He tested each step before committing his weight, reading the ground through his hooves in a way I've always envied about horses. The wind was from the northwest, which meant if I kept it on my left cheek, I was headed roughly east toward the broken fence. Every few minutes I had to stop and reorient, because the wind shifted in the hollows and you could lose your heading without realizing it. We went about a quarter-mile before I found the downed rail. It was leaning almost flat, just the way I'd seen through the window. The posts were still set. The wire had simply overloaded in the wind, the tension failing in a spot where I'd replaced a section last spring with wire that was probably not quite the right gauge. I'd known at the time that it was a compromise. February had come to collect. I went through the gap. The land on the other side was rougher immediately, more rock, more scrub, the ground starting to angle down toward the creek system. The snow on this side was deeper, less compacted, drifting into hollows that could be knee-deep in places on a horse. Granger picked his way through it with that same careful patience, his one good eye and one white eye both scanning. I was looking for shapes. In a whiteout, that's all you can do, look for anything that breaks the uniformity of the white. A dark mass, a movement, color. I found the cows first. They were about 200 yards east of the fence line, 7 of them, packed together in the lee of a big limestone shelf that stuck out of the hillside like the prow of a ship. They'd done exactly what I'd expected, drifted until they found shelter and bunched. 2 of them turned their heads when Granger and I came up. The rest didn't bother. They were cold and miserable but intact, and the limestone was breaking most of the wind, and they'd survive. Cattle are underestimated in their ability to endure. I counted them, 7 all 7. No rue. I sat on the roan for a moment, wind pushing against my back, and thought. A mare 3 weeks from foaling, even a smart mare, could go in any direction if she panicked. The horses were different from cattle in a storm. They ran. Cattle bunched and stood. Horses ran, and that instinct could carry them into places where the bunching and standing would have been salvation. The creek drainage was south and east. The ground dropped that direction. I turned Granger south and we went. I almost missed her. I'd gone maybe 400 yards, dropping down through scrub willow that whipped at my coat and Granger's face when the roan stopped dead. Not the kind of stop where a horse hesitates, the kind where he plants and refuses, every muscle locked, telling me with his entire body, something is here. I trusted that. I turned on the flashlight. She was in a wash cut below the main level of the ground in a depression that had maybe 5 feet of earth wall on 3 sides. She'd either found it or fallen into it, and at some point in the last few hours she'd made it her shelter because there was nowhere else. She was down, lying on her left side, which is not a position horses choose voluntarily for rest. They lie flat only when they're in distress or giving birth. She was giving birth. Or she had given birth. I was off Granger before I fully processed what I was seeing. I tied the roan to a willow branch, probably inadequate, but it would have to do, and I half climbed, half slid down the cut wall. Rue raised her head when she heard me coming. She made a sound I've only heard from a mare in labor or a mare in genuine fear. Not a whinny, not a grunt, something lower and more private than either. She knew me. I could see in the way her head fell back that she'd used significant energy in that raising of it, and that she was exhausted in a way that went past physical. There were 2 foals. I stood there in the beam of my flashlight, snow still driving even into the cut, and I stared at what was in front of me. 2 foals. I'd known Rue was pregnant. I had not known she was carrying twins. Twins in horses are rare enough to be a veterinary emergency. Mares aren't built for 2. Their uteruses can't typically accommodate 2 foals to term without one or both dying, or the mare dying, or all 3. Usually a veterinarian will intervene early, reduce to a singleton, give the pregnancy a fighting chance. The fact that Rue had carried both to term, that both were here present on the ground, was either a miracle or a catastrophe or both simultaneously. And standing in that cut in the middle of a blizzard, I didn't have the information to know which. The foals were on the ground together, pushed close against Rue's belly and each other. They were wet, which meant they'd been born not too long ago, but wet and cold in a blizzard are the same as a death sentence measured in minutes if nothing changes. I put my hand on the first one. A filly pale, almost cream, impossible to know in the dark and snow, but pale. She turned her head at my touch, and I felt the most enormous, lopsided relief of my entire life, because she was moving and her eye tracked, and when something that small is tracking and moving, there is still time. I put my hand on the second one. A colt, darker, he wasn't moving. I pulled off my glove and pressed my fingers against his neck, below the jaw, where you can sometimes feel a pulse in a foal. I pressed, waited. The storm screamed overhead. There it was, faint, irregular, but there. I put my glove back on and took my first full breath in probably 2 minutes. "Okay," I said out loud to all three of them and to no one. "Okay, here's what we're doing." Here is where I need to explain something that I've thought about many times in the 12 years since. I'm not a man who acts on instinct. I like to think things through. I'm deliberate, maybe to a fault. My daughter has told me more than once that by the time I've finished analyzing a situation, the situation has gone ahead and resolved itself without me. She's not wrong. I'm a planner, a considerer, a man who keeps a logbook because he believes in the value of recorded observation. In that cut, in that blizzard, with a mare on the ground and 2 newborn foals who were dying at different speeds, I did not think. I moved. Later, much later, I would sit with the logbook and try to reconstruct what I did and in what order, because that's the kind of man I am. I needed to understand what I'd done so I could believe it had really happened. The reconstruction took me 3 days of on and off writing and memory, and even then I'm not sure it's accurate. What I know is, I cracked 2 more hand warmers and tucked them against the colt's neck and side, under the fold of my coat that I draped over him. I pulled off my outer coat in the middle of a blizzard, something a man with good sense would not do, and covered both foals with it, leaving me in the wool underlayer. The cold dropped on me like something physical, something with weight, and I did not stop moving because stopping would have been very bad. I pulled the flask from the kit bag. I'd stopped drinking liquor 15 years ago, but I'd kept a small flask of whiskey in the kit bag for emergencies of the medicinal variety, and this qualified. I wet my fingers and got some of the whiskey on Rue's gums, not much, just enough to give her some fuel and maybe some warmth. She let me do it. Rue had always been a horse with more patience than most, not docile, not broken, but patient in a way that comes from trust rather than resignation. She let me doctor her because she knew me, and that knowing felt very significant in that moment. I checked her for injury. She was exhausted and cold, and her legs were trembling with the effort of having delivered 2 foals in the worst conditions possible, but she wasn't bleeding abnormally, and her gums, while pale, weren't white. She was in the territory of recoverable, just barely, but there. The filly found her feet while I was checking Rue. I heard the scramble before I saw it, that specific lurching, ungainly, miraculous sequence of motion that foals go through in their first attempts to stand. All long, wrong angles and determination. She went down twice before she found equilibrium, and when she finally stood, she stood with her legs splayed wide and her whole body trembling, and she was the smallest horse I had ever seen in my life, barely bigger than a large dog. She turned and looked at me with enormous, dark, wet eyes. I have never adequately described that look to anyone. I'm not going to try now. I'll just say that there are moments where the distinction between animal and person becomes very thin, not because the animal is pretending to be a person, but because you are briefly seeing something behind the eyes that is the same in all living things, and it unravels you a little. I had to look away and focus on the colt. The colt was the problem. He was cold in a way that the hand warmers and the coat weren't reaching. His breathing was visible. I could see the rise and fall of his side, but it was too shallow, too slow. In a human, you'd call it hypothermia. In a foal in a blizzard, born too early into too much cold with no mother to warm him because the mother was down herself, it was the early stages of the same outcome. I did something that I've told very few people, partly because it sounds strange and partly because it was so automatic that I still don't fully credit myself with having thought of it. I lay down next to him. I put my body against that small, cold, shaking body, and I pulled the coat over both of us as best I could, and I stayed there. The ground was frozen. The wind was still working its way into the cut in rotating gusts. Snow was piling on the coat. My wool underlayer was not designed for this, and I could feel my own temperature dropping at the edges, fingers, face, the tips of my ears going from painful to that pre-numb tingling that's actually the more alarming stage. I stayed anyway. I could hear the colt's breathing change. It took maybe 10 minutes. I don't know, time is a different thing when you're focused entirely on staying conscious and staying warm, but I felt the rhythm shift. Slower but deeper, more deliberate. His muscles, which had been slack and barely twitching, started doing something different. A tremor. Which sounds bad but was good. Trembling is a body trying to generate heat, and a body that's trying is a body that's not done. At some point during this, Rue raised her head again and looked at us. I want to be precise about what I saw, because I'm not a man who ascribes complex emotion to animals. I've been around livestock too long to romanticize them the way people who haven't do. But I know what I saw. She looked at her colt, and she looked at me, and something in her face shifted. Not gratitude, that's too human a word and too simple a concept. Something else. Recognition. Of the specific thing happening, of what I was doing and why, of a transaction between species that didn't require language to complete. Then she put her head back down, and I stayed where I was. The wind peaked about 40 minutes after I found them. I know because that's when the gust hit the wash cut sideways and knocked a willow branch loose that fell directly on Granger, who reacted by pulling back on his tether hard enough that I heard it snap. And I was suddenly up and scrambling, because a horse loose in a blizzard on the wrong side of a downed fence line was a different kind of catastrophe. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was standing 6 feet from where he'd been, facing into the wind with the resigned expression of a horse who has accepted that humans are going to keep doing this to him for as long as he lives. The broken tether end dangled from his bridle. I took hold of it, doubled it around my hand, and went back to the cut. I had to make a decision. I could not stay in this cut until morning. My own temperature was a real concern now. The filly was standing and had started nudging at Rue's flank, looking for milk that Rue, exhausted and cold as she was, might or might not have produced yet. The colt was better, still down, but better, his breathing more regular, his body putting out a faint warmth that I could actually feel now when I pressed my hand to his neck. Better was not the same as safe. I thought about what I had: rope, kit bag with minimal supplies, a flask, 2 more hand warmers, a flashlight, a coat, a horse who was already dangerously cold himself. I thought about the distance back to the barn. Quarter mile past the fence, then another quarter to the barn. In good conditions, 20 minutes on horseback. In this, 45 minimum navigating blind. I thought about what I could carry. And then I stopped thinking in circles and started thinking in solutions. This part took 20 minutes. I know because I was counting in my head, the way you do when you're trying to keep your mind tethered to something practical, so it doesn't start wandering into the darker territories of cold and fear. I cut 3 lengths of rope with a knife from the kit bag. I created a makeshift sling from the canvas coat, using 2 lengths to tie it into something that could support weight against my chest and Granger's neck. It wasn't sophisticated. It was the kind of rigging a desperate man makes with cold hands and limited dexterity, held together by knots that any sailor would consider insulting. The colt, when I lifted him, weighed perhaps 70 pounds. He was conscious by this point, not alert, not strong, but conscious, his eyes tracking and his legs doing that slow, disorganized cycling that foals do when they want to stand and can't. I put him against my chest in the sling, my arms under him, and I got onto Granger with a combination of effort and stubbornness that I would pay for in soreness for the next week. The filly, and this is the part that still moves me when I think about it, followed. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't known if she could walk yet or would walk yet. She'd been standing for less than an hour. But when Granger moved, she moved. Lurching, legs crossing over each other, stumbling on the rough ground, but moving. She stayed close to her brother in the sling the whole way back, close to me, close to the warmth we collectively represented. I looked back once for Rue. She was on her feet. She must have found what she needed in herself while I'd been rigging the sling, some deep body resource that exhaustion and cold hadn't fully depleted. She was standing in the cut, legs trembling, head low, but standing. She saw me looking. She took 1 lurching step, then another. I didn't wait for her. I couldn't carry her and the colt both, and the filly needed the direction of forward motion more than she needed me to stand still. I trusted Rue to follow, because horses follow horses and the filly's movement would give her something to track. I trusted her legs to hold. I turned Granger toward home, and we went back into the white nothing. The quarter mile to the fence took longer than I'd estimated, closer to an hour. The ground had drifted in the time I'd been in the cut, and what had been manageable footing going out was treacherous coming back. Twice Granger went to his knee in a drift, and I nearly lost the colt, catching him by instinct and sheer grip strength, and the coat sling that held better than it had any right to. The filly fell twice. The first time I stopped Granger and turned to look, and she was up before I could decide what to do, already scrambling back to her feet with that furious, wobbling insistence of a creature that is still so new to being alive that it hasn't learned yet what it can't do. The second time she fell and stayed down long enough that I felt my chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Then she was up again. I found the fence by almost riding through it. Granger stopped at the wire edge and I practically went over his head, which woke me up thoroughly because I'd been beginning to drift in a dangerous way, that cottony half-awareness that cold brings when it starts winning. I climbed off carefully, found the gap, led Granger through with the colt in the sling, and turned to watch the filly. She stopped at the wire, looked at it, looked at me. "Come on," I said. My voice was strange to my own ears, hoarse, low, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. She stepped through. I found the barn on memory and nothing else, navigating the last quarter-mile without a single landmark visible. My feet remembered the ground. My hands remembered the rope. And somewhere in the white behind me, I could hear Rue, a sound somewhere between a nicker and a groan, close enough to know she was there, far enough to know she was working for every step. The barn door was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my life. Inside, I put the colt down in the deep straw of the large foaling stall. He tried to stand immediately and made it halfway up before folding back down, and I put a hand on his shoulder and said, very quietly, "Not yet. In a minute." He seemed to understand, or at least to accept, which is close enough. I went back for the filly. She'd stopped at the barn threshold, that particular equine suspicion of the boundary between outside and inside. And I put my hand on her shoulder and waited until she decided the barn was acceptable, which took approximately 30 seconds of consideration before she walked in with a decisiveness that was almost comical. Then I went back for Rue. She was 20 yards from the barn door, stopped, her legs locked in the stance of an animal that has used everything it has, head nearly to the ground. The snow had built up on her back, a full inch of accumulation, white and thick, the kind of insulation that is also the final report of how long a body has been too cold to melt snow. I walked back through the storm and put my hand on her jaw and lifted her head until she was looking at me. "Almost there," I told her. She walked the last 20 yards on sheer stubbornness, leaning slightly into my hand the whole way, and when she crossed the barn threshold and the wind stopped and the warmth of the animals and the hay met her, she made the sound again, that private, low, exhausted thing that I'd heard in the cut, and this time I understood it differently. It wasn't fear, it wasn't distress. It was relief. I got the three of them into the large stall, Rue in the center, both foals tucked against her sides. I ran heat lamps. I brought warm water and electrolyte powder and stood there for a long time, watching Rue drink, slowly, carefully, in the small, deliberate swallows of an animal monitoring its own body. The colt found his feet at some point in the next hour. I was sitting in the corner of the stall, my back against the wall, and I was very nearly asleep when I heard the scramble, and I opened my eyes to find him upright, legs wide, the same impossible, precarious balance as his sister, standing in the lamplight. He was dark bay. His sister was almost palomino beside him. I wrote nothing in my logbook that night. I was too cold and then too tired. I sat in that stall until well past midnight, watching them breathe, and when I finally went to the house, I walked through a storm that had dropped to something merely severe, the worst of it passing east. 3 lines the next morning, that's all I wrote. Storm came in fast, rode out anyway, found something I wasn't looking for. Because some things are too large for logbooks, even ones you've been keeping for 32 years. And because the something I'd found, all 3 of them, alive, warm, Rue's nose moving slowly over both foals in that checking, cataloging sweep of a mare counting her own. That was the kind of thing you had to sit with quietly. It wasn't mine to explain. It was just mine to have been there. The second morning was the hardest. I've told people this and they always look at me with slight confusion. The second morning, not the night of the blizzard. Not the ride out, not the cut, not the colt on the ground not breathing right. And I understand the confusion. The storm was the story in the version most people want. The storm is the dramatic part, the survivable disaster, the kind of thing that makes people feel good when they hear it came out right. But the second morning was when the storm was over, and the real work began. And the real work is always harder. I slept until 6. Not by choice. I'd intended to be up by 4, check the herd, call the vet, do the 15 other things a February morning after a blizzard requires. But I'd sat down on the edge of my bed to pull off the second boot and woken up 3 hours later still wearing it, lying sideways across the bed with my coat on the floor where it had apparently fallen off at some point without my participation. The cold had gotten into my joints. This happens at 57 whether you've been riding through blizzards or not, but riding through blizzards accelerates the process considerably. I lay on the bed for approximately 4 minutes taking inventory of which parts of my body were just unhappy and which parts were actually damaged, and the answer was, unhappy everywhere, damaged nowhere, which was a fine enough outcome that I got up. The house was cold. I'd left the heat turned down before going to the barn the night before, the kind of automatic conservation habit you develop when you've lived alone for 13 years and learned not to heat rooms you're not in. I turned it up and stood by the kitchen stove while the coffee made, looking out the window at the aftermath. The storm had dropped maybe 14 inches. The yard was a new landscape, drifts that reached the bottom of the window on the northwest side, the truck buried to its running boards, the path to the barn erased. The sky was that particular shade of post-storm blue that Wyoming produces sometimes, hard and clean and absolutely without warmth, like the inside of a gemstone. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are indifferent to whether you survive them. I drank the coffee standing up. I thought about Rue and the foals. I thought about the fact that I hadn't called the vet the night before, which had been a genuine oversight and not an intentional decision. I'd been too cold, then too tired, then asleep without meaning to be. I thought about the fact that twins in horses were a serious veterinary complication, and that both foals surviving to this point was, statistically, improbable enough that I should probably get a professional set of eyes on the situation before I started congratulating anyone. I called Dr. Sorensen at 6:15, which was early enough that I expected to leave a message. She picked up. Crowe, she said, which is how she always answered my calls. Not hello, not her own name, just mine, like she was confirming I existed. I have a situation, I said. Is it alive? 3 of them Mare and twins. There was a pause on her end that said quite a lot. Ruth Sorensen had been a large animal vet in Powder River County for 20 years. She wasn't a person who was easily surprised. That pause told me the situation was exactly as unusual as I suspected. I'll be there in 2 hours, she said, assuming I can get the truck through. Roads passable east of the county line, I said. West side I can't tell you. I'll find out, she said and hung up. I went to the barn. All 3 were alive. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the best sentence of the entire year, for a year that had had some good sentences in it. And I stood in the barn doorway with the cold air behind me and the heat lamp glow ahead, and I let myself feel it for about 15 seconds, which is about 14 seconds longer than I usually allow for that kind of feeling. Rue was up. She'd eaten, or at least the hay I'd left in arm's reach the night before was partially gone. She was still exhausted. You could see it in the way she held her head, lower than normal, the careful, deliberate quality of her movements. But she was up and she was present, and when she heard me come in she turned and looked at me with what I can only describe as steadiness. The foals were both standing. The colt had found his balance at some point in the night, and he was navigating the stall with the concentrated intensity of a creature that has recently discovered that legs are a thing it has, and is working out the implications. He was already bigger looking than the night before, or maybe he was just dry now, his dark bay coat smoothed down from the wet birth tangle. He had a blaze, a wide splash of white down the center of his face that was dramatically disproportionate to his head, the kind of marking that looks like someone spilled something. The filly was smaller. She would always be smaller. That was the mathematics of twin births. One takes more of the resource and one takes less, and she had taken less. But she was quick in a way her brother wasn't yet, already experimenting with lateral movement, already turning to track sounds, already making small investigative movements with her nose that suggested she was going to be the curious one, the trouble one, the one who figured out latches before she should. I checked Rue's milk production. This was the central practical concern with twin foals. A mare's milk supply is calibrated for one foal, not two, and the smaller one, the filly, was at risk of being outcompeted by the larger one, the colt, simply through the physics of size and reach. Rue seemed to have production, which was good. I watched for 20 minutes to see that both foals were getting access, and what I observed was, the colt nursed first, as expected, but Rue kept moving, kept shifting, making her flank available in ways that seemed almost deliberate, that seemed to account for the smaller one waiting. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe mares don't operate on that kind of intention. I couldn't say. But what I saw was a mare making space for both of them, and I wrote that down later in the logbook with no interpretation attached, just the fact. Dr. Sorensen arrived at 9:17. I knew the exact time because I was watching for the truck and had been checking the clock at intervals, which is not a behavior I'm proud of, but which is at least honest. She was a small woman, Ruth Sorensen, short, compact, built low to the ground in the way that is very useful for the kind of wrestling matches a large animal vet gets into regularly. She wore her gray hair in a braid that she tucked inside her collar in winter, and she moved through a barn with the efficiency of someone who has never wasted a step in her life. She came in, looked at the stall, and stood silent for a moment in the same way I had stood silent the previous night. That moment of reckoning with something that statistically should not be in front of you. "Twin live foals," she said, mostly to herself. "Yeah," I said. "Full term. Close enough. In a blizzard." The timing was not ideal. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and went in with her kit. She spent an hour with them. She was thorough. Ruth Sorensen was always thorough, sometimes frustratingly so when you were waiting for a verdict and she was still taking notes. And what she gave me at the end of that hour was this. Rue was compromised but recoverable, likely to be back to normal function within a week with rest and nutrition. The colt was in better shape than he had any right to be, a little underweight, probably would always be slightly smaller than a typical single-birth foal of his bloodlines, but fundamentally sound. The filly was the concern. "She's functional," Ruth said, which was the most careful way I'd ever heard a vet describe an animal that was technically okay. "Her body temperature is normal. She's nursing. But she's at the bottom edge of viable weight for a foal her gestational age. And the immune challenge," she paused. "Twin foals don't get the same colostrum absorption as singletons. They're competing from the first hour. She may have gotten less than she needed." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means she's vulnerable. For the next 3 to 4 weeks, she's vulnerable to anything respiratory. Any pathogen that comes through this barn, she doesn't have the reserves to fight it the way a normally provisioned foal would." She looked at the filly, who at that moment was conducting a thorough investigation of the corner of the stall with her nose. "She's spirited. That helps, but spirited doesn't replace immunity." "What do I do?" "Keep the barn clean, keep her warm. Watch for any respiratory signs, discharge, coughing, labored breathing. Supplement her nursing with a foal milk replacer, small amounts often. And," she looked at me in a way that had some weight to it, "try to make sure she's not being outcompeted at the milk bar." "Rue seems to be managing that herself," I said. Ruth looked back at the stall, at Rue moving again, shifting that quiet accommodation, and was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "sometimes they know what they're doing. I won't give you every day of the next 3 weeks in detail. That would be its own story and a different one. But I'll tell you what the next 3 weeks taught me, because the blizzard night taught me one thing and the 3 weeks afterward taught me another, and they're both necessary. The blizzard night taught me that you can do more than you think when you have no choice. The 3 weeks afterward taught me how much harder it is to maintain that same intensity when survival is probable instead of immediate. The filly got sick on day 8. Not dramatically sick, not immediately obvious sick. The kind of sick that starts as a slight decrease in energy, a little less enthusiasm for the nose investigations, a slightly longer time between nursing sessions. The kind of sick that, if you weren't watching carefully, you'd miss until it became something you couldn't miss. I was watching carefully. I called Ruth on the morning of day 8, described what I was seeing. She came out and confirmed, early respiratory infection, exactly what she'd warned me about. She left antibiotics, an oral electrolyte supplement, and instructions that included checking temperature 3 times a day, and calling her immediately if it went above 104. It went to 100 and 3.8 on day 10. I sat in the stall that night with a thermometer and a log sheet and a level of focused anxiety that I found, afterward, somewhat difficult to fully acknowledge. I'm not generally an anxious person. I don't tend toward worst-case thinking. But the filly was in the corner, quieter than she'd been since the night she was born, the colt nosing at her in a way that seemed almost concerned, and Rue standing very close, closer than usual, with that low-headed watching posture that mares use when they're worried. 103.8. I called Ruth. "Keep monitoring," she said. "Below 104 is hard but manageable. The antibiotics need time to work. Make sure she's nursing or supplementing." "She nursed at 7, I said. "Barely." "Encourage it, gently. Don't force her, but make it easy." I hung up and sat in the stall and took my hat off and held it in both hands and thought very carefully about a thing I hadn't let myself think about. She might not make it. She'd survived the blizzard. She'd survived the first 8 days. She was feisty and quick and curious, and she had this habit of bumping her head against my knee when I sat in the stall, not asking for attention, just registering my existence, this small, repetitive here-you-are gesture that had become part of the rhythm of my days. And she might not make it, because the world is not fair about these things, and because small female foals born second in twin pairs in the middle of February in Wyoming carry a statistical weight that doesn't care about personality. I stayed in the stall all night. I sat against the wall. I dozed in segments. Every time the filly moved, I came fully awake and watched until she settled again. The colt slept beside her, their breathing out of sync but both present. Rue stood through most of the night, which horses do when they're on watch, though what they're watching for isn't always clear. What I sat with in that stall, through the long, cold hours of that night, was a different kind of question than the ones I'd faced in the blizzard. The blizzard had been, what do you do when you must act and must act now? This was, what do you do when you have done everything you can do and it might not be enough, and you have to sit in the uncertainty and not collapse under it? I have always found the second question harder. There were things I thought about in that stall. I thought about Margaret. This is not unusual. She comes to mind often in the barn, which was one of her favorite places and one of mine, and which therefore has a quality of shared memory even 13 years after her death. But that night I thought about her in a specific way, about the last few months before she died, which were the hardest period of my life by every measure I could apply. And specifically about a conversation we'd had in the hospital, maybe 2 weeks from the end, when I had sat next to her bed in that particular posture of a person who is holding themselves very carefully together, and she had looked at me and said, in the pragmatic way she had of cutting through sentiment to the bone, "You're going to be fine, Elias. You're already doing it. You're just not crediting yourself." I hadn't understood it then. I hadn't had the distance. Sitting in the stall on that night, with the filly's temperature at 103.8, and the antibiotics needing time they might or might not have, I thought I understood it better. You're already doing it. You're just not crediting yourself. The doing isn't the hard part, usually. The doing you do because you must, because the alternative is worse, because the situation requires it. What's hard is the acknowledging. The admission that you are in a moment that is real and difficult, and that your effort and presence are the only things you have to offer, and that they might not be enough, and that this is still worth doing. I stayed in the stall. The fever broke on the morning of day 11. I know this because I took her temperature at 6 in the morning, and it was 101.6, and I sat back on my heels and put my hand flat on the cold barn floor and breathed slowly for a long time. 101.6 is normal, the low end of normal for a foal, but normal. She nursed at 7, with something approaching her old enthusiasm. She bumped her head against my knee at 7:45, and I let her do it for longer than usual, which she accepted without comment. I called Ruth at 8. 101.6, I said. "Good," she said. "Yeah," I said. There was a pause. "Crowe," she said, "go get some sleep." "I have work to do." "The work will be there. Go sleep for 3 hours. The barn won't fall down." I didn't argue, which tells you something about my state, because I generally argue about being told what to do. I went to the house. I made coffee I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table for the first time in weeks, actually sat, not standing, and I looked out the window at the yard, where the blizzard snow was still present in north-facing drifts and shadows, but was beginning to show in the south-facing spaces the first dark patches of earth, the first suggestion of the ground returning. I picked up the logbook. I wrote for 40 minutes, the longest single entry in 32 years of keeping it. Not 3 lines, not a report, the whole story start to finish. The window, the fence, the ride, the cut, the colts breathing, the coat, the ground, the barn, Rue's face when she crossed the threshold. The filly's temperature at 3 in the morning, what I'd thought about in the dark. What I'd thought about Margaret. I wrote it all, and when I was done, I put the logbook down and closed my eyes. I didn't intend to sleep at the table. I slept for 4 hours. The names came to me slowly. This is how names usually come to me, not in a rush, but in a gradual accumulation, the way light comes in the morning, not a single moment but a long arrival. The colt, Ledger, because he'd entered the world like an item in the books, unexpected, unplanned, requiring a complete recalculation of everything that came before him. The filly, March, because she got her real start in the month that followed her birth, not the blizzard night but the slow days after, the fever, the nursing, the incremental climb back to something like strength. Because March in Wyoming, like February, is not a gentle month, but it's the month things start again. The ground comes back in March. The sky changes. What looked like it couldn't be survived often is. Rue didn't need a new name. Rue was who she was. I told my daughter the names on the phone 2 days later. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she gets when something has caught her off guard and she's deciding how much to show it. Ledger and March, she said. Yeah. Dad, you named a horse March because it's the month they recovered. Another pause. You're getting sentimental in your old age, she said. I've been sentimental the whole time, I said. I just kept it in the logbook. She laughed. She has a good laugh, my daughter, the kind that comes all the way from the center of her, the kind that sounds like her mother's. I'm coming to visit next weekend, she said. I want to see them. They'll be here, I said. The 3 weeks after the blizzard had a texture to them that I find difficult to convey in the same way I find the blizzard itself difficult to convey. The blizzard was large and acute, a crisis with edges, a thing you could look at and say that happened, and now it is over. The 3 weeks were quiet and ongoing, a long, slow application of presence and attention with no dramatic moments to mark progress. Just mornings and evenings, and midnight checks and temperature logs, and the gradual accumulation of small, unremarkable survivals. Day by day, here. I have thought since then that most of the things worth doing in a life have that quality. The dramatic moment, the blizzard, the cut, the coat over the colt in the wind, those are the moments people want to hear about, the moments that have the shape of stories. But they're not the majority of any life I know, including the lives of people and animals who are doing genuinely remarkable things. The majority is the 3 weeks, the temperature checks, the staying up, the calling Ruth at 8 in the morning with your voice steady because you've trained yourself to keep your voice steady in situations where steadiness is required, the sitting in the stall in the dark. That's where things either take hold or they don't, not in the crisis. In what comes after, my granddaughter asks me when I've told her this far into the story, did they turn out okay? Ledger and March. She's 12. She wants to know about the horses, and the horses are the right thing to want to know about. I tell her Ledger grew into his blaze. He was never quite as large as a single-birth colt would have been, but he was built solidly, with good feet and a sensible temperament that he got from Rue, and that made him easy to work with. He's 13 now. He still lives on this ranch, which is either testimony to my sentimentality or my practical judgment that he's worth keeping, depending on how you look at it. March, she was always the smaller one. She grew into it in the way that small creatures sometimes do, becoming something efficient and precise instead of large and commanding. She has Rue's patience and her father's brightness. I assume her sire was the neighbor's quarter-horse stallion who'd gotten through a fence line earlier that year, which was a whole separate drama. And she is the one who will stand at the fence line and watch you walk from the house to the barn, tracking you the whole way, with those large, dark eyes that have never quite lost the quality they had in the flashlight beam in the cut. That look, that thin distinction look. Rue died 4 years ago. She was 22. She went in the spring, which is correct, which is the right season for something that had survived so much winter. I was with her. My granddaughter is quiet for a moment when I tell her about Rue. Then she says, "Are you sad?" I think about the question. It's a child's question, which means it's actually the right question, the one that an adult would spend 3 sentences getting around. Sometimes, I say, the way you're sad about things that were really good, that kind of sad is different from the other kind. She considers this with the seriousness of a 12-year-old processing something new. I think I understand that, she said. It gets clearer as you go, I say. She picks up the logbook from the table between us. She looks at the outside of it, the worn cover, the corner where I dropped it in the barn once and the edge got wet, the specific fading that happens to things that are handled often. Can I read it? She asks. It's a question I haven't been asked before. Some of it, I say. The entry from that night is only 3 lines. She finds it on her own. She knows what she's looking for. She reads the 3 lines and looks up at me. That's not enough, she says. No, I agree. That's why I'm telling you. She puts the logbook down. Tell me the rest, she says. Why did you go out? People ask it expecting a particular kind of answer. Something about duty, or cattle management, or the economic necessity of not losing a pregnant mare. Those are real answers, and they are not wrong. A mare and a foal, or as it turned out, a mare and 2 foals, represent a real dollar figure, and a working ranch operates on margins that don't comfortably absorb preventable loss. But those aren't the real answer, and everyone who asks can tell I'm not giving the real answer when I offer them, even if they can't say exactly why. The real answer is, I didn't know why I went out while I was going. I only understood it later. This is the part of the story I haven't fully told anyone, not even my daughter, not even in the logbook entry that took 40 minutes and covered 11 pages. Because it requires admitting something that doesn't fit neatly into the version of Elias Crowe that I have maintained for most of my adult life. The capable one, the quiet one, the man who handles things without drama and keeps his own counsel and doesn't need much from anyone. That version was true mostly. But February of that year, the whole of it, not just the blizzard night, was a particular kind of hard. I need to back up about 3 weeks. January had been the kind of month that shows up sometimes when you've been alone for a long time and haven't been paying close enough attention to what that's doing to you. Not crisis, nothing acute, nothing that would read as a problem from outside. Just a slow accumulation of quiet that had started to have weight. I'd catch myself going days without speaking aloud to anyone except the animals and the occasional exchange at the feed store. I'd stand at the kitchen window in the evenings after the standing-up supper and feel something that I didn't have a precise word for, not grief, because I'd done my grief work as honestly as I knew how. Not loneliness exactly, because I'd chosen the life I had, and I chose it each day with some clarity about the cost. Something in between, a heaviness, the kind where the things you normally use to push through, the work, the structure, the sense that each day has a shape and a purpose, start to feel like performances rather than realities. I hadn't told anyone. This is what I do with things like this, which is the wrong thing, and which I knew was the wrong thing even while I was doing it. So when the storm came in and the fence line showed through the 4-second window in the snow, and I had that moment of standing in the kitchen calculating whether to stay or go, what I was also calculating without naming it was what I needed. I needed to be required, not by obligation, not by duty, by urgency. The kind where the outcome hangs on whether you act, where your presence is the difference between something surviving and something not. I went out into the blizzard partly because of the mare, and partly because I needed to be necessary in a way that would cut through the January heaviness like nothing else could. And I knew it, somewhere below the level where I keep my accountable thoughts. I'm telling this now because my granddaughter has the logbook and she's going to read it eventually, all of it, including the January entries where the heaviness shows up between the lines of feeding reports and maintenance, logs the way unhappy things always do, present but never quite named. And I'd rather she hear me say it plainly than piece it together from subtext. The blizzard saved me in more ways than the obvious one. I've told the story in a lot of forms over the years. The short version for people who want something inspirational and brief. The medium version for people like Ruth Sorensen who know enough about horses to appreciate the medical specificity. The children's version, which is the one I told at the county fair 2 years after it happened, which smoothed out the personal edges and focused on the foals, which is what the children wanted anyway and is not a dishonest version, just an incomplete one. This version, the one I'm telling now, is the whole one. It's the whole one because 12 years have put enough distance between me and that February that I can see it as a complete thing rather than a series of decisions made in real time. From far enough away, you can see the shape of something. You can see what it actually was, not just what it felt like from inside it. What it actually was, a man who was struggling, more than he'd admitted, finding something that needed him so urgently that it burned through the struggling like a fire through old paper. And being changed by it, not rescued, not cured, not fixed. Changed. The way something changes when it's worked on honestly over time, with heat and pressure and uncertainty. The changing took longer than the blizzard. That's the thing the story doesn't convey if you end it at the barn door. Here is what I did not tell you about the months after February. I called my daughter more. Not dramatically more, I'm not built for dramatic emotional declarations, and anyone who knows me would find them suspicious. But more, every week instead of every 2 or 3. And I started gradually saying more during those calls, not the big things, not right away, but the texture of the days, what the foals were doing, what March's fever had done to my sleep schedule, the specific quality of the light in the barn at 7 in the morning. Small things that a person alone accumulates and has nowhere to put. She noticed. She didn't say anything for the first month, which is a quality she has that I have always valued. She lets you do things at your own pace without making you perform the doing of them for her. But about 6 weeks after the blizzard, she said, near the end of a call, "You sound different, Dad." "Different how?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "More here." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. More here. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't mean much and means everything when someone who knows you says it. I was more here. I'd been less here for a while in the accumulated quiet of the January before. And something about that night, the cold, the requirement, the 3 lives that needed whatever I had pulled me back into my own presence in a way that I hadn't been able to do by will alone. This is a thing I've tried to articulate in the logbook over the years with limited success. You can know you're drifting and still not be able to stop it by the application of self-knowledge alone. Sometimes you need the situation to require something specific of you. Sometimes the requirement is what does the work that intention couldn't. I've heard this described as grace by people who use that word. I don't use it myself, or at least not easily, but I understand what they mean. There's a thing that happened in the spring, about 6 weeks after the blizzard, when March had fully recovered, and both foals were finding their legs in the east pasture in the way that foals do when spring comes, and the world has more room in it than winter does, that I've never written down and never told in any version of this story. My neighbor at that time was a man named Walter Runs Far. He'd ranched the property east of mine for 30 years, traditional Lakota family, 3rd generation on that particular piece of ground. We had the cordial, practical relationship of 2 men who share a fence line and will help each other when help is required, which is the most functional kind of neighbor relationship in that country. We weren't close friends, but we were, I want to find the right word, trusted. Trusted in the specific way of people who have demonstrated reliability in small things over a long time. Walter had heard about the foals. Word gets around in small counties, especially unusual word, and twin foals born live in a blizzard to a mare who survived both the birth and the night was unusual enough to travel. He'd heard the basic version from someone at the feed store. He came over in April on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to return a post-pounder I'd lent him the previous fall and mostly forgotten about. He walked the east pasture with me for a while. We watched the foals. He didn't say much. Walter generally didn't say much, which was one of the things I'd always respected about him. After a while he said, "Which one got sick?" "The filly," I said, "March." He watched her. She was moving fast across the pasture, already showing the quick-step energy that would define her whole way of moving through the world, that precision and speed, the small creature that got efficient instead of large. "She looks strong now," he said. "She is," I said. He nodded. After another while he said, "My grandfather used to say, the ones who almost didn't make it always know something the others don't." I thought about that. "Know it how?" I said. He watched March some more. She had stopped running and was standing at the far fence line, looking at something across the drainage. A hawk, maybe, or just the middle distance. Horses look at the middle distance, sometimes in a way that suggests they're thinking about something very specific that you'll never know. About what it cost, Walter said, to be here. He picked up the post-pounder and we walked back to his truck, and that was the end of it. He drove home. I went back to the barn. But I've thought about that conversation more times than I could count. The ones who almost didn't make it always know something the others don't, about what it cost to be here. I wrote it in the logbook, not an interpretation, just the words themselves. Some things you preserve without processing. You put them in the book and let them sit there for future reference. The year that followed the blizzard was different from the years before it. Not dramatically different. If you'd been watching my life from outside, you might not have noticed the specific ways. I still ranched the same 230 acres. I still kept the logbook. I still ate standing up. I still called my daughter weekly and talked to the horses more than most people would consider reasonable, and went to bed early and got up in the dark. But inside the year, things had shifted in the particular way that shifts do when they're genuine rather than performative. The January heaviness didn't come back, not in the same form. Other things came. Grief has many rooms, and you move through them on a schedule that doesn't consult you, but not that specific cottonwool quality of being less here than you should be. I credit the foals with some of this, which I understand sounds disproportionate. 2 horses, 1 night, 1 illness. But the caring for them was daily and close, and required exactly the kind of consistent, attentive presence that I had been, without knowing it, hungry for. You can't check a sick foal's temperature 3 times a day and be somewhere else in your head. You can't watch March learn to run and stay abstract. The world returns to specific weight, specific size, specific temperature, 101.6, and you return with it. I want to tell you about the 4th summer, not because it's dramatic, it isn't, but because it was when I understood that something had changed permanently rather than temporarily. Ledger was 3, March was 3. They'd grown into themselves in the ways I'd partly predicted and partly not. The way individual creatures always do, confounding the expectations you've built for them by being more specifically themselves than you can anticipate. Ledger, large, calm, methodical in all things, with a talent for work that had made him useful in ways I hadn't counted on. He'd developed, over those 3 years, a habit of waiting. Not patience exactly, but a particular kind of watchful stillness that made him extraordinarily good with new situations. He'd encounter something novel, a tarp in the wind, an unusual sound, a new person in the barn, and where another horse would startle or balk, Ledger would stand and watch with those intelligent eyes and the great white blaze, and wait until he'd understood it, and then proceed. As if he'd been born knowing that understanding comes before action. March, smaller, faster, difficult in the ways that quick-minded creatures are difficult, easily bored, interested in everything, capable of finding structural problems in gates and fences that I would then have to repair. She'd gotten herself out of the east pasture twice by figuring out a gap in the board fence that no other horse had ever noticed, despite being smaller than average and therefore, in theory, working with less leverage. She didn't go far when she got out. She just stood in the yard looking at the house, waiting to be noticed, which felt like a comment on something. That summer afternoon, I was working on the east fence, the same fence that had given way in the blizzard. I'd replaced the section properly, that March heavy-gauge wire, solid posts, and both foals were in the pasture behind me. The day was warm, the specific warm of high summer Wyoming before the afternoon thunderstorms roll in from the west, when the light goes golden and the grass smells like something about to end, and the shadows are long and honest. I'd been working for about an hour when I became aware that I was being watched. I turned around. March was standing about 4 feet behind me, head low, nose extended, watching my hands move on the wire with concentrated interest. Not interested in the fence. Interested in the doing, in watching something be fixed, being repaired, being made more than it had been. I had no rational basis for attributing intention to a horse watching fence work. But she'd been born in a cut in a blizzard to a mother on the ground, sick at day 8, temperature at 103.8, and she'd fought her way to a summer afternoon in Wyoming where she was small and quick and interested in everything, and standing 4 feet behind me while I fixed fences. I put my hand out and she put her nose in it. "You turned out okay," I told her. She blew air through her nostrils, which horses do. I went back to the fence. My granddaughter has been listening for a long time now. She's 12, and she has the attention span of her father, which is not a criticism of her father. It's actually very good. And she hasn't shifted or fidgeted or checked the window in the way that children do when they're politely waiting for an adult to finish. She's been actually listening. When I stop, she's quiet for a moment. Then she says, "Which one do you think knew about what it cost, like your neighbor said?" It's a question I've never been asked before, and it's a better question than most of the ones adults have asked me over the years. I think about it. "March," I say. "I think March knows, I don't know how, but when she looks at you, I stop. It's hard to put into words." "But you know," my granddaughter says. "Yeah," I say, "you know." She picks up the logbook again. She runs her thumb along the worn cover in the same way I've done 10,000 times without noticing I was doing it. "Can I keep this?" she asks. The question surprises me. More than the reading it question, more than the tell me the rest question. This one lands differently. I look at the logbook. 32 years of entries. Temperature logs and feeding schedules and weather observations and the 3-line night and the 40-minute night, and Walter runs Far's grandfather's words about the ones who almost didn't make it. Margaret's name appearing every few months in the margins, the way the names of people who are gone appear, not as grief exactly, just as presence, the way they're still just present in everything around you when you loved them right. "It's yours when I'm done with it," I say. "Are you done with it?" she asks. I think about the blank pages at the back. There are more than I expected. I haven't counted them in years, but the book has more left in it than I realized. "Not yet," I say. She puts the logbook on the table between us, carefully, in the way she's been taught to handle things that belong to someone who loves them. "Then I'll wait," she says. "There's a last thing I want to tell you, and I've been putting it off because it's the thing I've put off the most, even in the logbook, even in the long entry that I thought was the whole story and turned out to be only most of it. About 2 months after the blizzard, I went back to the cut. Spring had been advancing for a few weeks. The ground was soft in places, still frozen in others, the creek running with snowmelt. I went on foot, which I rarely do. I'm a horse and saddle man, generally not much for walking, because I wanted to move at a speed where I could actually see things. I found the cut by memory. It was less dramatic than the night had made it, smaller, shallower, the walls of earth less vertical, the bottom just a rocky depression with a little standing meltwater in the low point. Without the blizzard and the flashlight and the particular quality of crisis, it was just a place. A wash cut in the hillside. But it was where something had happened. I stood in it for a while. I don't know what I was looking for. Not a marker or a sign. I'm not that kind of man. I think I wanted to verify that it was real. That the night had taken place in a physical location I could return to, that it wasn't some compressed and over-remembered thing that my sleep-deprived, cold-addled mind had shaped into something more significant than the raw material. It was real, the ground was real. The willow branches were real, the broken one still lying where Granger's pull had knocked it. I stood there for a few minutes. I thought about what I'd been carrying into that night, the January heaviness, the less-here quality, the way I'd gone out into the storm partly because I needed to be needed. I thought about what I'd come home carrying, which was different, heavier in the good way, weighty with the specific gravity of things that had happened and mattered. I thought about Rue at the barn threshold, leaning into my hand for the last 20 yards. I thought I didn't know I was going out for myself. I thought I was going out for her. And the thing is, both are true. Both at the same time, fully, neither one diminishing the other. That's the part that took me the longest to understand, and the part that feels most important now. You can be going somewhere for a reason that isn't the whole reason, and you can find something you weren't looking for, and both things, what you went for and what you found, can be exactly right. Not instead of each other. Together. The storm came in fast. I rode out anyway. I found something I wasn't looking for. In the cut in the spring with meltwater around my boots, I added the sentences I should have written the morning after. What I found was also what I needed. I think I knew that without knowing it. I think we usually do. I went home. March was in the east pasture when I came back, running the fence line the way she did sometimes, for no apparent reason, just running because she could, because the speed was available to her, and she was a creature made to use it. She was 3 months old and small and quick and permanently interested in the world. She saw me coming across the yard, and she stopped at the corner post and watched me walk the whole distance from the gate to the barn, those dark eyes tracking steady. That look. I stopped when I reached her and put my hand on the fence rail between us, and she put her nose against my knuckles, checking. "Here you are." "Yeah," I said. "Here I am." The afternoon was going long-shadowed and golden, the hawks riding the thermals above the Powder River country, the grass coming in green where the snow had been. March stood at the fence line and looked at me with the eyes of something that had learned, very early, exactly what it cost to be here. I stayed until the light changed,